The letter was thin enough to see light through. Elowyn turned it in her hands once, then again, and set it beside the teacup on the side table as though it were nothing, a circular from a modiste, a note about a subscription. But Prue, standing in the doorway of the small upstairs sitting room at Thea's house in Cheapham, did not leave. She stood with her hands folded in front of her apron and waited. "You may go, Prue." "Yes, ma'am." But the girl did not move. Alawan looked at her. Prue was 23, the same age as Alawan herself, with a plain, watchful face and the particular stillness of a woman who had learned that discretion was a form of employment security. She had been with Alawan since before the wedding. She had packed the trunk the morning Alawan left the Duke's house. She had carried 7 letters to the post tray, each one returned without a word. "I said you may go." "I heard you, ma'am." A pause. Prue's gaze moved to the letter on the side table and returned to Elowen's face. "It is lighter than the others," Prue said, and then she left. Elowen sat in the chair by the window and looked at the letter for several minutes. The handwriting on the front was his, that slanting certain hand that had once signed the marriage register beside her name, the letters pressing into the paper as though he were slightly angry at the pen. The seal was dark blue wax, unmarked. He had stopped using his signet after the 3rd letter. Perhaps he had learned that the sight of the 7 arms made the returning easier. She had not opened the first 7. She had held each one, felt its weight, imagined what was inside, and sent it back by the next morning's post. It was the clearest language she had. Clearer than anything she had managed in 16 months of marriage. Clearer than the silence that had preceded it. Clearer than the morning she had risen, packed her traveling trunk, and left without a note. Returned letters were understood. They meant, "I do not wish to hear from you." They meant, "There is nothing you can write that will change what is." They meant, in the particular grammar of women who had no other recourse, the same thing that a locked door meant or a curtain drawn against a carriage window. "I'm done," and she had meant it, every time. She picked up the letter. It weighed almost nothing, 1 sheet folded once. She turned it over, slid her thumb beneath the seal, and opened it. 1 line. His handwriting in the center of the page, surrounded by white. "I would rather have your silence than anyone else's words." She read it once, and then she put it down. The morning light through Thea's sitting room window was thin and gray, the kind of English light that neither warms nor illuminates, but simply persists. Outside, a carter was calling to his horse, and somewhere in the house below, Thea's children were laughing. Ordinary sounds. Alawan sat with the letter open on her lap and listened to them for a long time. She had met Alistair Dacre during her 2nd season in the drawing room of Lady Ellerby's house in Berkeley Square, where a Tuesday evening concert had been arranged for the purpose of putting eligible young women in proximity to titled men while maintaining the fiction that everyone had come for the music. He was standing by the window with a glass he had not drunk from, watching the room with the expression of a man enduring a mild headache. She had been seated near the pianoforte with her mother, close enough to feel the vibration of each note in the chair. He was tall and quiet and unapproachable. He had dark hair cut shorter than fashion required, a jaw that made him look severe, and eyes that seemed to be looking at something several inches behind whoever spoke to him. He was 31. He held the dukedom of Severn, a seat in the House of Lords he rarely attended, and an estate in Wiltshire that his steward managed with minimal instruction. He was, by every measure society used, a catch. He asked her to dance at Lady Ellerby's. The dance was a cotillion, and his hand when he took hers was dry and warm and entirely steady, and he said nothing during the first figure except, "You dance well." She thanked him. He said nothing during the second figure at all. Afterward, he returned her to her mother and bowed and left, and Elowen's mother gripped her wrist and whispered, "That was the Duke of Severn," as though Elowen had not noticed. He asked her to walk the next morning in Hyde Park. They walked for 40 minutes along the Serpentine in pale early sunlight, accompanied by her mother at a discreet distance, and he pointed out a heron standing motionless in the shallows and said, "I have always admired the patience of herons," and it was the closest thing to a personal revelation he had offered anyone in years. He called on her father's house the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. He proposed in her father's study on a Wednesday afternoon in June, with the window open and the sound of carriage wheels on the street below. And when he asked whether she would have him, he said it in the same tone he used when requesting a second cup of coffee, not unkindly, but without urgency, as though her answer would determine the shape of his afternoon but not the shape of his life. She had said yes, not because she loved him, she barely knew him, but because she believed she could. Because she saw in his quietness a space that might contain something tender, something merely dormant, something waiting to be reached. She was wrong. The wedding was held at St. George's, Hanover Square, on a warm morning in September. The breakfast afterward was held at his townhouse in Grosvenor Street. 43 guests attended. Elowin's mother wept. Her father shook the Duke's hand with the particular combination of relief and sorrow that belongs to men who are giving their daughters to strangers. Thea, who was 20 and engaged herself, squeezed Elowin's hand under the table and whispered, "Write to me every week." She did write, every week for 16 months. The letters to Thea were long and careful and increasingly strained, because the truth they contained was not dramatic enough to justify the weight of its unhappiness. Nothing was wrong. That was the precise nature of the problem. Alistair was courteous. He inquired about her health at breakfast. He stood when she entered a room and sat when she sat. He accompanied her to 2 dinners and 1 evening at the theater during their first month, and at each event he was attentive in the way a man is attentive to a coat he has paid good money for. He kept it near, adjusted it when necessary, and thought of it not at all when it was not in the room. He did not ask about her day. He did not sit where she sat. He did not come into the drawing room in the evening to find her. He went to his study, where he read, or to his library, where he read differently. When she appeared at his study door with a book of her own and asked if she might sit, he said, "Of course," and returned to his papers without looking up. When she mentioned a passage she had enjoyed, he nodded. When she asked what he was reading, he told her the title and nothing else. She did try. She arranged the drawing room with fresh flowers and mentioned it to no one, waiting to see if he would notice. He did not. She asked Mrs. Vickery to serve his favorite wine at dinner on a Thursday, and when he drank it, he made no comment. She learned the names of his tenants from Waring, the steward, and inquired about the drainage dispute on the North Fields. He answered precisely, thanked her for her interest, and did not raise the subject again. It was not cruelty. Allowin understood that. Cruelty required intent. What Alistair offered was something worse, the absolute neutrality of a man who had done what was expected of him and believed the contract fulfilled. He had married. He had provided a house, a household, an income. He could not understand what else was being asked because nothing else had been asked of him in words and the language Elowin spoke. Presence, gesture, the turned page, the vase of flowers, the question about the North Field, was a language he had never learned. She stopped trying in their 10th month, not with a decision, not with a scene. She simply ceased making the small, hopeful gestures that had defined her first year, and the house adjusted around her silence with barely a ripple. Mrs. Vickery noticed. Waring noticed. The footman, who had grown accustomed to setting 2 places in the dining room each evening, began to set one in the dining room and one on a tray, and no one commented on the change. It took him 6 more months to understand that she was gone, even while she was still in the house. On the morning she left, she woke before dawn, dressed in her gray wool traveling pelisse and the bonnet with the dark ribbon, and packed one trunk with the help of Prue, who said nothing. She walked down the staircase of the house in Grosvenor Street at 6:30 in the morning. The hall was empty. A single candle burned on the table near the door, left by the night footman. She paused at the bottom of the stairs and listened. The house was silent, not the silence of sleep, but the silence of disuse, the particular quiet of rooms that had stopped expecting anyone to enter them. She left no note because there was nothing to say that the silence had not already said. When Alistair returned from Westminster that evening, he had begun attending sessions of the House of Lords with a regularity that Waring attributed to restlessness rather than duty. Mrs. Vickery met him in the hall. "Her Grace has gone to her sister's house in Cheapham, Your Grace." He looked at the housekeeper for several seconds. "When will she return?" "She did not say, Your Grace." He nodded once and went to his study. He did not ask again that evening. It took him 2 full weeks to write the first letter. Elowin did not know what the first letter said. She did not know what any of the 7 letters said. She held each one, the first thick, the second thicker, the third, fourth, and fifth progressively shorter, the 6th and 7th nearly the same weight as each other, as though he had settled into a length, and returned each one by the morning post. Prue carried them downstairs and handed them to Thea's housekeeper without expression. No one asked why. The servants understood. Thea understood. Even her father, Sir Geoffrey Lacey, who had ridden from Dorset to see her after the second week, and sat in Thea's parlor with his hat on his knee and his face tight with questions he did not ask, understood. Does he mistreat you? No, Papa. Does he keep another woman? No. Then what is it, girl? Elowen looked at her father's face, red and bewildered and old, older than she had noticed, and said, He does not see me. I've been in his house for 16 months and he has never once looked at me. Sir Geoffrey was quiet for a long time. Then he put his hat on and stood. I'll not force you back, he said, but I'll not pretend to understand it either. After the 7th letter was returned, the letters stopped. A month passed. February became March. The days grew longer, and the light through Thea's windows shifted from pewter to pale gold, and Elowen did not mention the letters. She walked in the mornings along the lane behind Thea's house, where the hedgerows were beginning to show green, and the air smelled of turned earth and wood smoke. She helped Thea with the children in the afternoons, reading to the eldest, walking the youngest in the garden when he would not sleep. She read in the evenings, though she could not have named afterward what she had read. She went to bed at 10 and lay in the narrow guest bed and listened to the house settle into its nighttime sounds, and she did not think of the house in Grosvenor Street. She did not think of the empty post tray or the silence that now occupied the space where his letters had been. She told herself the relief was genuine. The letters had been an intrusion, each one a small violence against the boundary she had drawn. Their absence was what she had wanted. She had returned them to produce exactly this silence. It was working. She did not speak of Alistair. She did not speak of the house in Grosvenor Street or the estate in Wiltshire. She built a life the size and shape of Thea's spare room, and she fit inside it, and she told herself this was sufficient. But Thea watched. You checked the post tray, Thea said one morning at breakfast, buttering toast for her youngest without looking up. You did not do that before. I do not check the post tray. Every morning, when you come down, your eyes go to it before they go to me. Elowen set her teacup in its saucer with a click that was louder than she intended. I am checking whether there is correspondence from Papa. He promised to write about the bay mare. Thea said nothing, which was the most eloquent thing she could have said. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March. Prue brought it up. She held it differently from the way she had held the others, not on the tray but in her hand, flat against her palm, as though she were delivering something breakable. She set it on the side table beside the teacup and did not leave. It was lighter than the others, one sheet, folded once. And now Elowen sat in the chair by the window, with that single sheet open on her lap, and the sentence written across it in his hand, and the morning light falling on the page, and the sound of Thea's children downstairs, and the carter calling to his horse, and the entire weight of 16 months of silence pressing against the back of her throat. I would rather have your silence than anyone else's words. She read it again, and again. She folded the letter along its original crease and set it on the table. She stood. She sat. She picked it up and held it against her chest and closed her eyes, and for the first time since she had left the house in Grosvenor Street, she felt something crack open inside her. Not grief, not relief, but something older than both, something that had been waiting beneath the composure, like water beneath ice. He had not asked her to come back. He had not apologized. He had not explained or justified or begged. He had written one sentence that said, I know what you are doing. I know what your silence means, and I choose it. I choose you even in your refusal. She did not write back. She went to Prue and said, Pack the trunk. Prue, who had been mending a stocking in the kitchen, looked up. Which trunk, ma'am? The traveling trunk. A pause. Prue's needle hovered above the darning wool. All of it? All of it. Thea found her on the staircase, bonnet already tied, pelisse buttoned, gloves in hand. The children were napping. The house was quiet. You read it, Thea said, not a question. Yes. What did it say? Elowen looked at her sister, Thea, who had taken her in without hesitation, who had set the spare room with clean linens and never once said you should go back, who had understood the returned letters without being told what they meant. Thea, who was watching her now with the expression of a woman who already knew the answer. One sentence. And you are going to him? Yes. Without writing first? Yes. Thea was silent for a moment. You know what that means? Arriving at his house, without a letter, without a chaperone. I know what it means. The servants will talk. His neighbors. Mrs. Vickery will have told every housekeeper between Grosvenor Street and St. James's. I know. Thea looked at her for a long time, and then she did something she had not done since they were children. She stepped forward and pressed her forehead against Elowin's forehead, holding her by both wrists, and closed her eyes. Go, Thea whispered. Go now, before you think about it any longer. The journey from Cheapham to Grosvenor Street took an hour and 40 minutes in the hired carriage. Elowin watched the city sharpen through the window as the roads narrowed and the buildings grew tall and soot-darkened and familiar. The carriage smelled of damp leather and old tobacco, and the springs were bad, and every jolt sent a small tremor through her hands where they rested on her lap. She did not rehearse what she would say. She did not know what she would say. She had spent 11 weeks constructing a silence so complete that it had become a kind of architecture, and now she was dismantling it without plans, without tools, with nothing but a single sentence tucked into the inside pocket of her pelisse, folded once, flat against her stays. Twice during the journey she nearly told the driver to turn back, once at the bridge, where the river was brown and swollen with March rain, and once at the corner of the square, where she could see the rooftop of the house and the chimney from which no smoke rose. Both times she placed her hand against the letter through the wool of her pelisse and felt the paper crinkle against her ribs, and she stayed. When the carriage stopped, she stepped onto the pavement and looked up at the house she had left 11 weeks before. It looked the same. The windows were clean, the steps swept, the black iron railings straight and gleaming. It looked like a house that had not noticed her absence. The door opened before she knocked, not because anyone had seen her coming. Elowin would learn later that the footman, Daniel, had simply heard a carriage stop and gone to the door as a matter of routine. But when he saw her, his face underwent the particular rearrangement of a man who's been trained not to show surprise and is failing at it. Your Grace. Good afternoon, Daniel. She stepped past him into the entrance hall, the black and white tiles, the console table where the candle had burned the morning she left, the staircase curving up into shadow, the smell of beeswax and coal and something else, paper or ink, or the particular close air of a house where only one person has been breathing. Mrs. Vickery appeared at the end of the corridor so quickly that Elowin suspected she had been standing near the service door. The housekeeper's face was flushed, her eyes bright. She curtsied deeply. Your Grace, shall I prepare? Where is the Duke? A hesitation. In the library, Your Grace. He has been in the library most afternoons. Since... She stopped. Shall I announce you? No. Elowin walked down the corridor and stopped at the library door. It was closed. She could hear nothing from inside. No movement, no page turning, no fire. She put her hand on the door handle and stood there. She was aware, in that moment, of the precise dimensions of what she was doing. A wife returning to her husband's house after 11 weeks of separation, without warning, without a letter of intent, without a chaperone or a companion, or even the formal structure of an appointment. Arriving at his door the way a debt arrives, without ceremony, demanding only to be answered. She opened the door. He was sitting in the leather chair beside the window, and for one vertiginous moment she thought he was reading. His head was bent, his hands were in his lap. But he was not reading. He was sitting with a closed book on the table beside him and his hands resting on his knees, staring at the carpet between his feet with the expression of a man who had been sitting exactly like that for some time. He looked up. She watched the understanding arrive in his face the way weather arrives on an open plain, slowly, then all at once, sweeping across his features and changing everything it touched. His lips parted. His hands tightened on his knees. He stood, not quickly, not with the urgency of a man who had rehearsed this reunion, but slowly, as though he were afraid that any sudden movement would prove she was not really there. Elowin. It was, she realized, only the 4th time he had said her name without her title in front of it. I read your letter, she said. He said nothing. He stood by the chair with his hands at his sides and looked at her, and for the first time in the entirety of their acquaintance, she saw that he was frightened, not of her, of what she might say next. You wrote 7 letters, she said. I do not know what they said. They said very little. His voice was rough, as though he had not spoken aloud in days. I am not. He stopped. His jaw tightened. He tried again. The first letter requested your return. It was written in the language of a solicitor. I'm ashamed of it. And the others? Each one was an attempt to say something I did not have the words for. Each one failed. She took a step into the room. The library was dim, the curtains half drawn, the candles unlit, the afternoon light falling in a narrow column from the gap between the drapes. It smelled of leather and dust and the cold hearth. And the last one? The last one was what remained when I stopped trying to explain. She reached into her pelisse and withdrew the letter. She held it up, one sheet folded once, his handwriting visible through the paper. "This," she said. "This is what you should have said at breakfast, in our first month, in the drawing room when I brought my book, at the dinner table when I mentioned the North Fields. This is what you should have said every time I entered a room and you did not look up." His face was very still. "Yes." "Why couldn't you?" "Because I did not know I needed to." The simplicity of it struck her like a hand. Not cruelty, not indifference, just the blank incomprehension of a man who had never been taught that love was something you did, not something you had. "My mother died when I was 9, he said. He had not moved from his place by the chair. "My father raised me as he raised the estate, efficiently, without sentiment, with an eye to what was owed and what was due. I was taught to provide, to manage, to maintain. I was not taught," he stopped again. "I was not taught to sit in a room with someone and be glad of it. I arranged flowers," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Every week. In the entrance hall, in the drawing room, and the morning room, 12 arrangements in 16 months. You never mentioned them. I noticed them. You did not say so. I noticed them after you left, when they were not there." She felt the tears then, not falling, but pressing, hot and tight behind her eyes. She held them. She had held them for 11 weeks, and she would hold them now. "I did not need you to speak," she said. "I needed you to stay in the room." He crossed the distance between them, not quickly, slowly, carefully, the way one approaches a creature that might bolt. He stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her face, and she saw that his eyes were red, and she understood that he had not been reading in the library. He had been sitting in the chair, in the half-dark, waiting without knowing he was waiting. "I cannot promise to be what you deserve," he said, "but I can promise to remain in the room." She did not fall into his arms. She did not weep against his chest. She stood where she was and held the letter between them and said, "That is all I ever asked." They stood like that for a long time, not touching, not speaking, but present. 2 people in a library in the late afternoon light, learning how to occupy the same silence. Mrs. Vickery, who had been standing in the corridor since Alohan's arrival, heard nothing from inside the library for a quarter of an hour, and then stepped quietly away to instruct the kitchen that dinner would be served for 2. The return was not immediate. It was not a single moment, but a series of small, deliberate adjustments, like a house being reopened, room by room, after a long closure. Alohan moved back to the house in Grosvenor Street the following day, but she did not move back to the bedchamber they had shared. She took the room across the corridor, the blue room, with its view of the garden, and Alistair said nothing about the arrangement. He understood, or was learning to understand, that proximity was not the same as presence, and that she would come closer in her own time. He began to stay in the drawing room after dinner, not reading, sitting. Sometimes with a glass of wine he barely touched, sometimes with his hands simply resting on the arms of the chair. Elowen would read, or sew, or do nothing at all, and he would be there. Not speaking, not needing to speak, just remaining. He asked about her day. It came stiffly at first. "How was your morning?" At breakfast, delivered with the careful enunciation of a man repeating a phrase in a language he is studying. But he asked, and when she answered, "I walked in the garden, the roses want cutting." He listened, and the next morning he said, "Did you speak to the gardener about the roses?" And she nearly dropped her teacup because it was the first time in their marriage that he had remembered something she said and mentioned it again. The flowers returned, not because she arranged them, because he did, badly. A clumsy fistful of garden stems jammed into a Chinese vase on the hall table, stems too long, leaves still attached, water splashed on the marble. Mrs. Vickery found them and nearly removed them, thinking a footman had left them as a joke. But Waring stopped her with a hand on her arm and a look, and the flowers stayed. Alohan saw them when she came down for breakfast. She stood in the entrance hall and looked at the crooked stems and the water stain and the single white rose that had already begun to drop its petals, and she pressed her hand against her mouth and laughed, the first time she had laughed in that house. He heard her. He was on the stairs. He stopped and looked down and saw her standing by the vase, laughing, and something in his face shifted. Not a smile exactly, but the shadow of one, the way a landscape changes when the sun passes behind a cloud and then emerges again. She moved back to their bedchamber in May. The season was beginning, and society had its questions. They attended the Marchioness of Fenton's ball in early June, their first public appearance since Elowin's departure, and the room watched them the way a room watches a horse that has once thrown its rider. She wore ivory silk with pearl clasps at the shoulders. He stood beside her all evening. When Lady Bexford, who had the manners of a canon and the discretion of a church bell, inquired loudly whether the Duchess had enjoyed her stay in the country, Elowin smiled and said, "Very much. My sister's children are delightful." And Alistair, standing at her shoulder, said nothing at all, which was precisely right, because the question had not been asked of him, and he had learned, by then, that his wife could hold her own ground without assistance. Waring noticed the change before anyone. The Duke began asking questions about the estate, not the drainage or the rents, which he had always managed competently, but the household. How did Mrs. Vickery prefer to arrange the linens? What flowers grew in the south garden? What Allowin ate for breakfast when he was not there? Small questions. The questions of a man who was mapping a territory he had lived in for years without ever learning its geography. In August, they went to Wiltshire. The estate, Severn Park, was everything the townhouse was not, wide, green, open to the sky. Allowin walked the grounds every morning, and Alistair walked with her, not always speaking. Sometimes they walked a full mile in silence, and it was not the silence of the 16 months, compressed and airless and filled with things unsaid, but a different silence, the kind that grows between two people who have agreed to be in the same place at the same time and need nothing more from each other than that. He sat in the House of Lords through the autumn session. She managed the Wiltshire household through Waring, and the London household through Mrs. Vickery, who had served 2 duchesses before Elowin and considered this one, quietly, to herself, without ever saying so, the finest of the 3. The staff at Severn Park learned to set 2 places at every meal. The footman stopped carrying trays to separate rooms. In November, Allowin told him she was with child. He was in the library, the same chair, the same window. She came in without knocking and stood in front of him and said it without preamble, because she had learned that he heard direct speech better than he heard implication. He looked at her. Then he stood, and he took her hand, and he held it against his chest, not theatrically, not with the grand gesture of a man in a novel, but simply the way one holds something that one is afraid of dropping. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am well." "Are you certain?" "I am certain." He nodded, and then, still holding her hand, he said, "I should like to remain in the room." She laughed again. It was becoming easier. Their daughter was born the following June, on a morning of extraordinary heat, with the windows open and the curtains pulled back and the sound of larks in the fields beyond the garden. They named her Frances, after no one, a new name belonging to no ancestor, carrying no obligation. Elowin held the child, and Alistair sat beside the bed and watched them both with the expression of a man who has only just understood what furniture he has been living among. A son followed 2 years later. They named him Geoffrey, after Elowin's father, who rode up from Dorset and held the boy in the chapel and wept into his collar without embarrassment. The letter remained. Elowin had kept it from the beginning, folded once in its original crease, tucked inside the cedar writing box her mother had given her before her wedding. But when they moved permanently to Severn Park the year Frances was born, she had it framed. A simple gilt frame, not large, hung on the wall of their bedchamber between the window and the dressing table, where the morning light struck it. One sentence, his handwriting, dark and certain, leaning slightly to the right. "I would rather have your silence than anyone else's words." Frances, at 4, asked what it said. Elowin read it to her. Frances considered this for some time, holding her rag doll by one arm, and then said, "Is it a poem?" "Yes," Elowin said. "It is." Alistair was standing in the doorway. He had come to ask about dinner. He heard his daughter's question and his wife's answer, and he leaned against the doorframe and pressed his knuckle against his lip and said nothing at all, which was, by then, exactly what she needed. Prue stayed on as lady's maid for 11 more years, until she married the undergardener at Severn Park and moved to the cottage at the edge of the south lawn, where Allowin could see her hanging laundry from the morning-room window. When asked, years later, what she recalled of the Duchess's time at Thea's house, Prue said only, She checked the post every morning, and when the letters stopped, she checked more often. Thea visited every summer with her own children, who grew up chasing Francis and Jeffrey through the Wiltshire gardens. She never asked what the one sentence said. She did not need to. She had seen her sister's face on the staircase that Tuesday afternoon, bonnet tied, gloves in hand, already halfway gone, and she had understood that whatever he had written, it was enough. Not because it was eloquent, because it was true. And Alistair, who had spent 31 years learning how to manage estates and attend the lords and conduct business and do everything that was expected of a Duke of Severn, spent the rest of his life learning the only skill that mattered: how to remain in the room. He was not always graceful at it. There were mornings he forgot to ask. Evenings he retreated to the study and closed the door and had to remind himself, physically, to stand and walk back to the drawing room where she was reading. But he did it. Every time. He stood and he walked, and he sat beside her, and he stayed, and she looked up from her book and saw him there, and it was enough. It was, in the end, a very simple story. A man who did not know how to be present, a woman who could not stay where she was not seen. 7 letters that said too much, 1 that said only what was necessary, and a single sentence framed in gilt, catching the morning light in a bedchamber in Wiltshire, mistaken by children for a poem. They arrive here, like a letter opened at last whenever they are ready.